Good morning, seventh graders. I hope you had a good weekend. It is Monday morning, and we're going to do a lecture from page 255 to 269. So listen closely, and you get some pretty important points. Um, West Africa is where most of the slaves that came to America came from. And West Africa had had a long history of empires and fairly advanced civilizations. They had traded with the Arabs in North Africa and had connections to Europe for many, many centuries. They had been exposed to most of the same diseases and so forth. So Europe and North African Arabs knew that Central Africa had black tribes and so forth. And some of these tribes actually established empires and had universities and so forth. Um, as far as slavery was concerned, slavery has been around for as long as human beings have been around. And for most of its history, especially before the year 1400, it was within the same culture or possibly captured people from warfare. And it was not based on race. So if you were a debtor and you owed a lot of money and you lived in some country, you could become a slave to pay off your debt. Or if your army attacked another army and defeated them and captured villages, more often than not, they would take the women and children, sometimes the men, and enslave them as well. After 1400, slavery was mostly based on race, and the unfortunate victims tended to be Africans, black Africans. And so that's the big difference between 1400 and after 1400 and before 1400. All right, of course, the astrolabe and the caravel and stuff made it possible for Europeans to sail further, as you know. And so that allowed, especially the Portuguese, they were the first to start the African slave trade. But the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the English were the main groups that were involved in the African slave trade. Ordinarily, what would happen would be the European powers would make a deal with the rulers of the black African kingdoms along the coastline, who were usually at war with the interior tribes. They would tell the black African kings, capture us some interior tribesmen, bring them to the coast, and we'll buy them from you. And so they set up a series of fortresses and prisons, basically, along the coastline, and the Europeans would arrive. The black African chieftains and nobility in that area of the world would then give or trade the captured interior slaves to the Europeans for guns and rum and other materials that the black kingdoms wanted, that the coastal kingdoms wanted. And so it wasn't entirely a white versus black situation as far as the slave trade. There were a lot of black Africans involved in the slave trade as well. And they got wealthy from it along the coastlines of West Africa. So remember, West Africa is where most of the slaves came from. Slaves had no rights. They were considered property. The passage across the ocean from Africa to America or to Europe, but we'll talk about America, was called the Middle Passage. What was it called? Middle Passage, right? And that's because the trade route went from England to West Africa, and then from Africa to America, and then America back to England. So the slave passage was in the middle. It was the second one. So it was known as the Middle Passage. Remember that slaves were considered properties for sale, so they were crammed into the ships as tightly as possible. Much of the water and food that they had was virtually horrible. It was terrible. Obviously, the sweat and the stench and the urine and the feces and everything, with all these hundreds of slaves crammed onto a ship, created unhealthy situations. Anywhere from 10 to 20% of all Africans died on board these slave ships. They would be thrown overboard to make room for other slaves. Sometimes living slaves would be thrown overboard if they ran low on food. It was a horrible, horrible situation. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 11,700,000 Africans were taken out of Africa. They mostly went, however, to South America and the Caribbean islands. Only about 6.8% of all the slaves went to North America. The vast majority, like I said, to South America and the Caribbean. When they arrived in America, they were purchased and sent to plantations. Now, a plantation, as you should know, is a large farm that grows a cash crop. And in early American history, of course, tobacco, rice, sometimes indigo, but which was made as a dye, a plant that produced a dye, a beautiful blue dye. And then later, cotton were the main crops that were grown on plantations. There were some wheat and things like that, but it was mostly tobacco and cotton, and rice were the main ones, and sometimes sugarcane as well in the extreme south. The life for a slave began before sunrise. They would have to fix their breakfast in their cabin. They did not lay in beds. They slept on the floor in hay, basically, and however they could. They'd fix their breakfast. They had to report for work on time, and they worked from sunrise to sunset, and sometimes into the night, with very little breaks. They were allowed to eat a little bit. They were allowed to get drinks and so forth, but they had to work very hard. And then in the evening, after these long days, they had to then prepare supper and things like that. And so then they'd go to sleep, and they'd do it all over again the next day. They worked spring, summer, and fall. In the wintertime, there was very little to do, so they did have some time off. They were given holidays occasionally, Christmas and Easter and things like that. It was up to the master and the mistress to make sure that they were taken care of as far as food and clothing and medical care. So there was some expense to the upkeep of slaves. It was not to the benefit of an owner to be overly cruel. Yes, slaves were whipped for disobedience, and they were punished in various ways. But if a slave owner beat a slave to death, they lost a lot of money because slaves were very expensive. Most people who owned slaves were wealthy. Poor and moderate wealth people could not afford slaves. Maybe if you owned a business or something like that, or had a little farm, you might be able to afford like one slave to help you out. But the vast majority of the slaves were owned by very, very wealthy people. And they also controlled the politics of the colonies and later the states. Now, in Virginia, when Virginia was established in 1607, they needed workers to come work in the tobacco fields. So what they initially did was they invited people from England as indentured servants to come over. An indentured servant was a poor person who paid who had their way paid to America by a wealthy person, and they agreed as to pay back that payment by working for that wealthy person on a plantation for a number of years, usually about 5 to 7. So if you were poor, you could come to America as an indentured servant. However, most indentured servants died before they were free. The other problem was they were white and they were English, so they could escape and blend in. And many of them just chose to bug out and go to the frontier where they were out of reach of their owner or the person who had paid their passage. They were not slaves technically, but they had signed a contract, and they would escape. And they would take their own land. There was plenty of land, and they would just kind of vanish and start their own farms. Native Americans were tried as a labor force, but they died of the European diseases very easily, and they escaped because they knew the country. They were Indians, and this was their land, so they could just disappear at night, and you'd never see them again. Well, near 1619, which was actually even before the Puritans arrived, up in Plymouth colony, if you remember that. In 1619, a Dutch ship brought 20 Africans. They were not slaves. They were sold as indentured servants. But within about a 30, 40, 50-year period of time, Africans were made into lifelong slaves. They no longer had the ability to win their freedom, etc. And so they were sold as slaves. The main reasons were because they could not escape. They didn't know the land. Number 2, the color of their skin. They were easy to identify. And number 3, your book doesn't mention it, but they were pretty hardy. They were used to hot climates. But mostly for the color of their skin, they were easy to identify. And so the African slave trade began. I've already told you a little bit about life on the farms, the plantations. Um, it was very harsh. Slaves could marry, but it had no legal basis for existing. So consequently, a man could have his wife sold off. He had no right to his children. She had no right to her children. The children could be sold off. So families were separated in that way. It was a horrible institution. So why did slavery take hold in the South? Well, because the climate, and you could have plantations down there, was perfect for slavery. New England was too rocky and too cold. The middle colonies really couldn't have plantations. They had some farms, and there was some slavery in the middle colonies, but not a lot. There were a few slaves here and there. One of the things that helped slavery grow was a thing called primogeniture. What's it called? Primogeniture. And it was the practice of leaving the plantation to the eldest son, the oldest son, which meant that the younger boys had to go out and find their own land with the money that they got from their dad. They had to go out and find their own land to start their own plantations. Consequently, slavery and plantations spread all across the South because these younger sons wanted plantations of their own, so they took over land and started them. So primogeniture allowed slavery to grow. Then in the 1790s, cotton was really hard to. You'd harvest it, and then you'd have to hand pick all the little tiny seeds out of it, the little seeds, and it took hours and hours and hours. So there had to be a better way. So a New England Yankee by the name of Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in the 1790s, which you put the cotton in, and you turned a crank, and the fresh, clean cotton came out with all the seeds taken out. So once he invented the cotton gin, it became very popular at plantations for them to own a cotton gin so they could process more cotton. Well, if you process more cotton, you need to grow more cotton, and you need more slaves to grow the cotton. So the cotton gin caused slavery to explode rapidly because of the explosion across the South of all these cotton farms, cotton plantations. So the cotton gin caused the institution of slavery to spread. It caused cotton plantations to spread westward, which had bad impact on the slaves. Obviously, you needed more slaves, plus the slaves had to uproot and move westward to like Arkansas and Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi, places like that. And it had a very negative effect on the Native Americans because the land that was used for these new plantations had been owned by the Native Americans. Now, by the late early 1800s, by about the early 1800s, the United States no longer needed to get African slaves. So the United States had what was called the domestic slave trade. If you needed a slave, you could buy it here in America, buy the slave here in America, buy them, I should say, buy the slave in America, and use them wherever. You could send them wherever you wanted to. Slaves were human beings, and they had children, and the children, the way they determined whether a child was a slave was whatever the mother was, that's what the child was. So most of the slave women had given birth. Well, obviously all the slave women had given birth to children, and so their children were slaves. So the slave population reproduced itself and naturally grew. So American slaveholders no longer needed to go to Africa. So that was the domestic slave trade. We just finished page 269 in under 15 minutes, so I can post this on YouTube. If you're not sure, go read through or listen to this again and do your reading and do your reading quiz for these pages. All right. Thanks, and you guys have a wonderful day. It looks like a nice day outside. Bye. See you tomorrow, probably.